Now available in paperback and e-readers, Isis, Samurai Goddess. The goddess next door takes on kung fu killers in this action-packed martial arts Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Samurai Goddess in paperback and e-readers today. While I was doing research for my latest novel in the Spinsterella trilogy, The Legend of Mad Matilda, I stumbled upon a graphic novel written by Andy Watson and penciled by Josh Howard called Clubbing. And this graphic novel, Clubbing, was a very interesting thing to me because I had rarely ever seen, graphic novels about the Gothic subculture. So I decided to put $5 down on one and pick it up off eBay. And after reading it, I decided to do a review because it encompasses two of my favorite things, the goth subculture and comic books. And as I was doing research on this graphic novel, I learned some things about DC Comics that were quite interesting. Now, in 2007, DC Comics was going to try to enter the manga marketplace with a series of graphic novels as part of its Minx line. Now, this Minx line was designed to try to appeal to girls, and they wanted to appeal to girls in their different interests with these graphic novels. Now, these graphic novels are very similar to something I proposed for my own ISIS series as a series of graphic novels that pretty much contained a story in a single volume. And I liked seeing that concept played out here with this clubbing book. But when I read this book, the thing that really disappointed me about it was the execution, because the big problem with this clubbing book isn't the art, it really is the story. And the story really is what really killed the Minx line in 2008, because the Minx line only came out with maybe 3 or 4 titles before it pretty much collapsed due to poor sales. And one of the reasons why this Minx line had such poor sales was due to the writing, because when I looked at this clubbing book, Josh Howard's art is really amazing. When you look at his art inside of the comic, it really pops. It has a lot of energy, and it's really dynamic. I mean, I really like Josh Howard's art. It's really, done a disservice because of a really, really uneven and unbalanced story. And it's really sad because I believe that this format could have done very well in comics if it just had the right story and a well crafted story. But this story, as it was presented by the writer, just really wasn't up to par. Now, this story in clubbing follows this Charlotte Brooke, teenager who decides she's going to get a fake ID and try to go to a goth club. And then when she gets caught by her parents, they decide to send her to her grandparents in the countryside and have her work at the country club as a punishment. Now, when I read that part of the premise, it was just pretty uneven, and it really didn't make sense to me to pretty much send a child away as a punishment. And in some ways, that kind of felt like some sort of abandonment of the child. It wasn't like saying, we want to help this child get their life right or deal with this in a constructive way. I would think, in some ways, that type of punishment would be kind of extreme to send a child away for the summer to the countryside. It felt kind of forced as a premise. When I read that part of the story, it just felt really forced and it didn't really feel organic. And when I look at the Charlotte character, the way they presented her, they try to present her as a sort of a brat, but it just comes across as really underdeveloped and, again, very uneven. It's like the writer kind of is trying to force things to work, and it really doesn't come together in an organic fashion. And that pretty much was shown to me in the first 10 or 15 pages of the graphic novel, that the story really wasn't coming together and it really wasn't flowing, because it was really a real chore to try to get through this story. And what makes the story even harder to read is all the constant exposition that is done in almost over 50 or 60 pages of the graphic novel. Now, as a novelist myself, I like to see a story really move very quickly. And for me, the first 10 pages are pretty much paramount. And in a comic book, the first 3 pages are incredibly paramount towards establishing who the main character is, what they want, and why we should care. But with this story, I mean, it took almost 20 pages for me to find out who the main character is, how she wound up in this situation. And the sad part is, I really didn't get that reason to care about anyone. Then, as the story progresses, we just get introduced to more and more characters, and not any sort of character development of this Charlotte Brooke. She seems visually like a very interesting character. Her goth look, is very visually interesting. It's a very interesting look, and the cover really catches your attention, and the designs of the character really catch your attention. Unfortunately, the writing is the problem with this graphic novel, in that it moves at a very slow pace, and that slow pace is not something you want in a comic. A comic is supposed to be, one, an escape, and two, it's supposed to be very fast paced. Whether it be superhero comics or comic strips, comics have to pretty much move very quickly, because the faster the pace goes, then the reader can pretty much imagine these pictures moving, and it was hard to see these pictures moving. Now, this is supposed to be a character who's a goth, but as I read the story, I really didn't really see too much about the goth subculture here. It felt like really window dressing as I was reading the story. It just didn't really, you know, have that sense of authenticity. It just felt like a surface thing. And yeah, they do talk about goth elitism, but they seem like they took it over the top. And it's like every character she ran into who was a goth was pretty much an elitist. And I always felt that that was, the writer wasn't really trying, really didn't understand the subculture. And it was like, it didn't make sense to me, because how can everybody she ran into have this kind of elitist thing going on? And it clearly showed me that she didn't really understand subculture the way it really is, because everybody isn't an elitist, but the way they present it in clubbing, it's like almost every goth character she runs into is an elitist, and that's not what the subculture is. It's like they really didn't understand what goth is. They didn't understand how it's just a person with a darker perspective, and it was hard to really see that in this story. Again, the story really did not come together. And then when they tried to, put this mystery in towards the middle of the book, that really made the book really fall apart, because they're supposed to be, she's at this country club, and she has to work at this golf shop, and as things are going along and she's spending the summer there, one of the people winds up dying in a mysterious fashion. And this mystery, it just feels disjointed, because first we get this introduction, and we're taken into a mystery. So it feels like I'm in two different genres instead of it being one central story. Because if the story was pretty much cohesive, it would be about her spending the summer there. And then all of a sudden we get this mystery, and this mystery pretty much makes the story uneven. It felt like, to me, like they were trying to take a young adult story and translate it into a comic book. And what the sad part is that a lot got lost in translation with this clubbing graphic novel. It's like the writer was trying to force things to work, trying to force parts of the stories to come together. And because everything feels so forced, the story really came across as really uneven. And it really was, again, a real chore to get through. And it was really sad to see this, because I look at this whole concept and platform that DC was trying to set up with this Minx line, and the sad part is it could have worked if they had executed it properly and had some really good stories. I look at this character and the visuals in this comic. I mean, this comic has some amazing pictures and amazing visuals here. Josh Howard's art is amazing in this comic, but just that they don't give him a story that's of quality to sell to the reader. They don't give you that great story to really get you interested in it. I thought this format, this 5x7, this is a good format for comics, this manga style. But the problem is that DC Comics just couldn't get the writing up to speed, and their writers couldn't execute the concept, and that's why this book pretty much died in sales. I mean, a lot of people probably didn't even know this existed, because of because there wasn't able to build the word of mouth due to the writing. And the writing on this, again, was just not good at all. I read this comic all the way through about 3 times when I got it in the mail, and I tried my best to try to see what the story was about, but the story just fell apart right in the middle with the mystery, and then the climax at the end just made no sense to me. And then the ending, which was trying to set up for a sequel, made even less sense to me, and that's why I see this story, it just fell apart. I look at this story and it just wasn't there, and it was sad because this format, as I see it, it could have been a brand that would have helped DC compete with manga, but the problem with DC is that they pretty much have had editorial problems for years, and this Minx line could have done something. I believe it could have really done something if they had the right writers who understood the comic book medium and understood that you just write, if you write good stories, you're going to pretty much be able to get the attention of readers on in any format, because comics are a great medium for telling stories, but you have to have the right type of story to tell that reader. And this clubbing really wasn't a good story. It was trying to mix the goth subculture with golf, and that was supposed to be some sort of metaphor on clubs, but the whole thing is that the writing just, again, felt forced, awkward, uneven. A lot of the characters were not really developed properly. A lot of the storylines pretty much didn't come together. And the writers told instead of shown in the comic book medium. A lot of the problems that I see with many modern comics were on display here in clubbing, and that's what made this graphic novel very difficult to read and very difficult to follow. And I could look at the material and pretty much see why this book pretty much failed to get an audience based on what I read. And it was just sad to see this happen with this book because, again, this format could have had some promise to it, because I've seen lots of mangas and stuff catch on because the writing is really good, but it just didn't seem like DC understood how to appeal to readers. They tried to make it appeal to girls, which was another mistake, because good manga or good anime has great characters in it, and good manga, when it's well written, pretty much has characters that appeal to both boys and girls. And that was another thing I had an issue with this clubbing, is that it tried to pander just to girls, like saying only girls can be goths, without trying to say, let me make a great character and let me make a compelling story, because that's what's going to pretty much attract readers to the comic and see it as exciting. Now, this clubbing is available on eBay. That's where I got my copy from, and you can pretty much get your copy there. And you probably will have a different opinion of it, but I really wanted to like this clubbing. I really liked Josh Howard's art, but it was hard for me to pretty much like this book because of the terrible writing. If you like this channel and you want to see more great content, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. And if you want to try some of my SJS Direct titles, such as the ISIS series, you may do so by clicking the link to the Amazon.com link in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.